The topic today is to talk about community engagement methods. And the first is just to recognize that there are so many people in our community who know lots about this. And it's not meant to, say that there's one specific way of doing things. And certainly there's applicability, because if we are all learning in Western institutions, we may forget the right way to approach community, or also to have some views as organizations or community members as well about how we should be approached ethically, and that we want to try and reinforce upholding important principles when it comes to community engagement, research with communities, and making sure that this is all done in an ethical way. So I do want to also acknowledge that this work has been done by some of the students that have been working with me, including Erin Lynn, Beto Loyola, and also Elaine Boiling. So the reason that we decided to go ahead with this project a few years ago was with my role working as the chair of the group for research with Indigenous peoples at the University of Calgary. And somewhere around 20 to 30 times a year, I'd have one of my colleagues or a researcher come up to me or email me and say, I have this research idea. Can you connect me with an Indigenous community? And that, certainly you're wanting to help people along in their learning journey about appropriate community engagement. But it also made me realize that if I kept doing the work for others, they wouldn't learn how to do the work for themselves. And so we wanted to provide some concrete guidance for people to be able to do this work themselves as well, and not just be relying always on a few team members or a few Indigenous faculty members to do the work. And we also wanted to reinforce that this work is really important from reciprocity and longitudinal relationship aspect. So having it depend on one person to do many different projects wasn't very sustainable in the long term either. And so we wanted to give people guidance around how to connect with a community and how to keep that relationship strong and fruitful for the community primarily, but also then for the researcher too. And so what we decided to think about was how we might want to promote community engagement along a spectrum. And so we had looked at a literature review that we had done in arthritis research specifically, but we wanted to critique how well the different research groups or research manuscripts had actually described community engagement in their publication or in their write-up. And we used a spectrum that was promoted by Faulkner and Beltane, and looked at a spectrum of engagement ranging from informing community, consulting community, involving community, collaborating, and then finally empowering. And of course, what we want to do is aim for the more distal end of the spectrum, where the community decides what the research is, how it's going to be done, and are entirely responsible for it, and don't really need to rely on external members unless there's an advantage for the community to do so. So we also broke that spectrum down into the different stages of research and talked about how you might inform a community when you're starting research, or how you might involve a community at the stages of data collection, and then how the results are shared as well. And so using this matrix, we went ahead and basically critiqued rheumatology research to see how often this was actually done with Indigenous communities. And most of you will not be surprised that there was very little engagement described in manuscripts and papers in this literature. And so most of the time, we would see very little written about how people had engaged community before the research even began. We would see more basically what we rated as consulting with community at the stage of data collection. And this was basically that if they said there was signed consent to participate, that's a very low bar, but that is basically all that people would describe. There was a little bit more in the literature in terms of how the community was involved with data collection, and this could involve hiring community members to collect the data or be a part of teams that were doing that. But certainly by the time we got to the end of research where we're taking results, putting them together, and then writing papers, we talk very little, and that we is meant in a rheumatology research spectrum. We spend very little time actually talking about how these results were shared with community, how they actually made change in the community, or what was being done in next steps. And so we hope that this would basically instill a desire for rheumatology researchers, and then researchers more in general, to aim for higher standards in their research, and also to share how they did that in their manuscripts, so that there's some element of quality of the research process shared as well. But what I found in that role as chair of GRIP was that, you know, we'd say, okay, well, we have to meet with a community and start talking about it. And we felt that the researchers didn't really understand, or they wanted more concrete, sort of tangible instructions around how to initiate relationship with community and then sustain it. And so we thought, well, what we should do is put together some guidance and some guidelines or some best practices or something like that, to put all of those results together and make a list basically for people, so that they had some ideas of how to concretely move forward. And so the approach that we took was to perform an integrative review, which is a form of a systematic review, and then put together concrete actions through a thematic synthesis. So what the students did was to create a search strategy, and I can share that after if people are of interest. We've submitted this for peer review, so hopefully it will be available too. But of course, they went through a selection process of which articles were going to be included, and ultimately came out with 52 papers that talked about different concrete steps in pardon me, community engagement. And this included all the countries of US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as well as Indigenous communities in Ecuador and Peru. From those 50-ish studies, the students extracted over 1,200 different actions that you could, or that had been described around how to engage with community. And so then we started this synthesis process where we boiled it down to about 213, which still felt to be fairly unmanageable. And so we put some more groupings together and came out with 37 final recommendations. And that's what I'm going to walk through with today, giving some examples about how this can be enacted along different stages of research. What we wanted to do too, though, is put this into understanding the process of research, that there's some activities in research that are very linear, but that there's also some overarching concepts. And so what we're going to walk through individually are steps that the researcher can take before even engaging in research, so really focusing on preparation and learning. Then how to go about establishing relationship and understanding what the research needs might be in a community, talking about the actual research activities itself, then the stages of analysis, interpretation, and then finally what to do with those research products. But then we've put in these two overarching aspects, which is how to continue that partnership and build trust, and then also to how actively reflect on your actions as a researcher or as a research team, and how the process of research has gone. So the first stage is preparation and learning, and we wanted to make this very explicit to researchers. that it wasn't that you just jumped in with your research knowledge and could, go in there completely blind and not aware of what happens in communities and how we've gotten to this place of our current status of health and well-being related to colonial process. And so we ask the researchers to go first and instruct themselves about Indigenous peoples and history. So we wanted to make sure that the researchers understood how colonization has affected Indigenous peoples' health negatively, as well as some of the local customs and history of Indigenous communities to be engaged. And so in here, we've talked to specific examples about how to go about identifying good and, if you will, cultural sensitivity and competency training. And those, of course, are both at the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to knowing about Indigenous populations and how to interact with them. But we have to start somewhere because many of the researchers would have no context from their own education around history. We also want them to understand the key concepts of intergenerational trauma, certainly how power differentials exist and primarily in research continue to exist, and then also being able to engage and understanding some of the local contexts and protocols that exist. Some of the things that we've also, and this was part of the experience of being chair of that committee, was that some people aren't even aware of the language that they're using with community members and how traumatizing some of that language can be. So I've been a part of, for example, grant applications, and the researcher would make a comment that it was time to go ahead and scalp the text of the grant to make it fit into the page. And of course, that is a particularly horrible thing to say. And so we want the researchers to understand that they have to be very careful about how they speak and the things that they've said. And if they have used something inadvertently, apologize and be very transparent and humble, basically, that they made a mistake and they're going to work towards being better in that. We also, sorry, and I'm just flipping through a couple pages here, speaking to the history of research and how it's affected Indigenous peoples. And again, my own discipline is one of the biggest offenders when it comes to research and biobanking. So back in the 1970s, there was a rheumatologist who went to a community in BC under the guise of trying to understand distribution of rheumatic disease in a particular population, took several samples, which the community understood was meant to be around testing for autoantibodies. And in fact, the samples were all sent over to England and were used for genetic research that was never approved by the community. And it's important for researchers who aren't community members to understand how horrific that is. I mean, it wouldn't even be acceptable in current research standards, whether it was Indigenous community or not. But the fact that that has never been righted is also a big problem. The other thing that we want researchers to understand is that research has always been done within communities. That's how we've understood and learned over time, and that Western-based paradigms are not the only way to approach a problem, that there are other ways of knowing. And so we need the researchers to understand that as well. And then finally, also to be attuned to the different research ethics that exist. So knowing that there are different oversight bodies within community, knowing that there are different protocols and guidelines when it comes to working with different populations, even within Canada. And then understanding that there will be different requirements at the research ethics boards levels as well, to make sure that those are all felt to be upheld appropriately. So the next phase that we speak about is around establishing relationship and research needs. And this is where it's a variable between communities around how to seek that approval. And so that's part of the learning process, is understanding what is approved in that community and the right way to go about it. So for some communities, it may be working directly with chief and council immediately. Other communities, it may be to work with the community members first and have them bring it forward to their chief and council, and then understanding about how to go about developing the appropriate documentation or approvals that there will be a relationship that can be commenced, basically. So to identify who that decision maker is, determine the permission to even proceed with any community engagement might be the most important next step in that project. It's also here where we discuss and sorry, I think we skipped a slide. Actually, that felt out of order for me. So here we go. I'll just back step a little bit here. So one is the introduction to community. And we want people to understand that this isn't a one-time quick meeting and you can go ahead once you've had one single meeting. This is a longitudinal relationship. It will take a significant amount of time investment. And so the researcher has to be completely committed to that upfront and not expect anything differently. How to start to interact with community, that may be through individuals or formal positions within an institution or a community where those things happen. It's important to have done your homework as a researcher to understand how to go about doing that. And then again, understanding, are you engaging directly with council or leadership or with community first? We never want to impose our research ideas on a community. It's really, again, there's so many priorities in community, and especially in states right now, like where there's a pandemic, or if there's a different state of emergency related to a natural disaster or opioid crisis or something like that. We really don't go in with a project that's already preset and important to us on the Western side, but not important to community. And understand that there may be no role for you as a researcher. There may be no interest in your project, and that may be just the way it is, and to be able to accept that, not to force your ideas or what you'd like to do on a community. It's also important to understand here that a project you must also reflect on the unintended harms of the research that you are proposing or that might be of interest to the community, because of course we don't want to make anything worse than before either. And think about the sustainability of those benefits of research should there be approval to proceed. All right, so here's where we go back to the organizational structure. If there is agreement to proceed with research, then developing the appropriate documentation or agreements to support that. And then moving ahead with different community events. So for example, accepting invitations to participate in community events, health fairs, career fairs, and making sure that you're observing the protocols in that community for establishing a relationship. That may be meeting with particular members of the community, that may be through sharing meals. And one of the things that might be unusual for researchers, especially depending on the type of research they're engaged in, is that this isn't just simply a one-way transfer of relationship from the community to the researcher. It's also important for the researcher to share about themselves and about where they come from and such to again build that reciprocity in the relationship. The other aspect of this too is just to make sure that the work that you're doing is accessible to people. So there are barriers to transportation, there's barriers to telecommunications. And so we want the researchers to know that it's part of their responsibility to make sure that people are able to participate, that those meetings aren't one-sided, that there's many opportunities and time left for dialogue and exchange with community members, and also to be savvy about what is going on in the community. So if you've planned an event, but for example, an elder has passed away, it may not be appropriate for that event to go forward. It may have to be postponed or rescheduled. So that's all part of the flexibility that needs to be learned here as well. Finally, in formalizing participation of community members, this may be appropriate if the community says they want a group that's working with the research team, or a group that's advising the research team, or a group that's overseeing the research team, formalizing that participation, and again, making sure that all the protocols are followed and that the members are compensated for their time and devotion to the project as well. It may be necessary to advocate to your institution to help financially support those arrangements, but it is your role as a researcher to do that if so. And also to keep that team level, so you're not having your research team going in as the authority or telling people what to do. You're there to be a helper and to work alongside the community for what they have agreed is important for them. So really you're serving as a resource or facilitator as opposed to the boss. All right, so then going on to the actual research activities itself, once all of those approvals are in place and the relationships are built, then thinking about your research approach. And this may be at the point where you're writing an application for funding or deciding what the appropriate way to get to your research answer is. So we want to use a strength-based research lens when developing the research goals and objectives. And so we want to also make sure that there's at least one objective of addressing structural change and strengthening community through this work, and also to make sure that there's really good partnerships and equity as we go ahead with any sort of research activities. We also want to identify what the strengths are in that community and build on them. So making sure that you're spending lots of time understanding the community, seeing the resilience or the strengths in it, and working those into the research approach as opposed to imposing a Western lens on it. In terms of research methods, so we want those to be, again, something that the community has comfort with, that is something that when the approach is taken, it makes sense to people, that it's not a foreign concept. I've made a mistake of going in and trying to do a very it was a survey design, and it was to get feedback on the psychometric properties of a survey, and it was a very difficult survey, even for people that work in it all the time. The psychometrics are very difficult with it, and so at the end of the day, the survey had to be abandoned, and we had to go with a totally different approach to understanding what it was that we were trying to get to with that survey. When it comes to budget, making sure that you appropriately resource community-based aspects of it, and ideally transferring the funds acquired to the community, or having the community hold those funds directly from the funding body where possible. This is something that is in flux. It wasn't common even 5 years ago for community to hold funds, but institutes like Canadian Institutes of Health Research have created mechanisms and policies for that to be enacted, so that there's control of those funds by the community. Ethical research processes, so it is in the community's hands what data can be collected, and also we want to uphold all the usual ethics when it comes to risks of research and protecting privacy, but also respecting that some people want to be identified in research for what they've contributed to the ideas. All right. Then hiring community members. So it's important to have really good research protocols and support so that community members are the ones able to do the work and self-determine activities. And so again, transferring funds to community to employ those members is actually easier logistically than to do it through the university platforms. In terms of participant recruitment, again, here we want to think about strategies that make it easy for people to participate. So making sure that there are mechanisms in place to support elder care or child care if you need people to be participating in a research like a talking circle or a survey or some data collection. And also be aware, that there will be many other projects potentially going on at the same time, and you may be looking for the same participants as another research study. So it's really good to collaborate with others and understand how you can all work together to minimize burden to individuals in the community. And again, this is part of that process of setup where you're making sure that the research that you're doing is going to have an impact and be beneficial and sustainable in the community. Also really important, I think, to build in a mechanism where you're receiving feedback from leadership and community about the research process itself and how things are going. Is the project still needed, or should it be abandoned? And that you're also working on your relationship building all the way through. It's probably where things go off the rails is that you may have had agreement and approvals, and as the research is ongoing, something does not go right in that relationship, and then the research basically is stalled or is not being done in an appropriate way. And it's important to correct that immediately or stop whatever is going on so as to not, again, bring any harms onto the community. And then we move to the analysis and interpretation stage. And so here, it's really important to have community members helping to interpret those findings and results along their knowledge and views and paradigms, and understanding from their perspective how this is helpful to their community, and also what are some of the implications of the findings. It's also important to respond to concerns and questions, obviously, so we don't want to be hiding outcomes or hiding results, and just making sure that everyone is at peace with the results and understanding before doing anything further. One of the things that was a specific statement that would come out in those 1,200 statements was that it's really important not to change the meaning of language used by community members when it comes to to generating data interpretation. So not reframing things from a Western lens when there's a strong Indigenous lens and language around what they have shared. So it's really important to preserve that, to preserve the integrity of the data. Sorry, just to go back for one quick second. So again, this will be dependent on the nature of the organization or leadership that you're working with, about whether the community leadership holds that basically control about what is released about the community, and being sure that they're aware of what the implication of the results are, or what the results showed before going about doing much more. Again, there'll be a very different lens, perhaps from a policy perspective, that needs to be taken into consideration before you move forward. And this is where the approval for dissemination comes into as well. And so you're not to go ahead and, have worked in a good way all the way through and then realize, oh, there's an abstract deadline due tomorrow. I'm going to throw something together, put it in, and get approval from the community after the fact about it. It's only to go ahead if you have expressed prior approval and on the terms and conditions of the community. So that may include things around authorship. It may include things such as community members having their travel paid for to come to the presentation or to be a part of the presentation ideally. And so it's important to have all of that in place before we pursue the usual Western expectations of presenting and publishing. Anything that's disseminated should be approved by community leadership first. And again, with the express knowledge that that data remains under the ownership of the community. Really important not to think just about Western-based dissemination, but also think about how those results are shared with community. That may be through a large community forum, maybe through the local newspaper, it may be through whatever presentation you're asked to do in community as well. But making sure that that's all, again, appropriate and approved before proceeding. We also want to think about the ethical considerations, and this goes back to how people describe what they've done in their research process, in their manuscript or publication. And of course, people will all write that they've upheld OCAP or they've upheld ITK principles or they've upheld this throughout the process of research. And we're going to get into this with the active reflection overarching piece as well. But be honest about what you did and did not do, what did not go right, how you had to correct it. Make sure that you're accurately presenting how that research process went. And finally, if there's any commercialization that's come about based on your results, then make sure that that's benefiting the community and not the individual researcher. So then to speak about the overarching aspects of partnership and trust. So here we want to think about how we've been building that relationship all the way through. It's really important to understand that we're there as researchers to also be working towards that empowerment end of the community engagement spectrum. So what have we done to help bring others up, to help others gain skills, to help others gain employment, all of that. So really important to think about co-learning and capacity building throughout the research process. Thinking about the relationship, thinking about grounding it in that respect and openness. That's not a word, openness, sorry. And really that, the fact that the research is done does not mean that the relationship is over. So there's a continual need to be building towards how you're helping the community if they ask you to in the next phase after that one single project is done. You're constantly seeking for consent and reconsent, and also leaving open that space for an ability for a community to exit the relationship if they choose, and that you're always upholding values, protocols, and rules in relationship to, or in relation to building relationships and being flexible with that. Thinking about how to shift that power away from researchers and back to community, and also thinking about how you evaluate that degree of power sharing throughout the entire research process. And then to think about active reflection as well on how you've done as a researcher. And so, it takes some fortitude because perhaps this is not the most efficient way to build the CV that you need to keep your academic appointment, or to pump out like 4 papers a year or whatever it is that the institutions are expecting. You have to think about how the Academy is basically placing expectations that aren't appropriate for the work that you're doing. And you have to be able to negotiate challenges and tensions that are arising throughout that process. Think about how knowledge doesn't come from just one lens. Think about the things that are being gained as well in your own knowledge about different ways of knowing and being and doing. And to realize that, that there's going to be times when you make mistakes, that you're going to be criticized, you're going to be challenged or confronted, and it's really important to address those and not, step away just because things aren't going well. It's to work through and again, approach with humility to how you can be a supporter. All right, so what we'll do at this point, I just wanted to share one of my favorite places in the world, which is the White Shell in Manitoba, which is where I was fortunate to spend every single summer of my life, and a place where I don't know that we'll get to this year, but just wanted to share the beauty of home with you all. And what we'll do is we'll stop the screen share and we'll stop the recording, and then we'll have a time for question and answers.